reptiles after all. So we can imagine that they walked around the earth in those days, similar to other reptiles such as lizards and geckos, but now due to the curse, they're limbless. This I've mentioned earlier, but this stumped me for quite some time. What does the legs of a snake have to do with the curse? Why was it so significant for God to remove the arms and legs of the snake? It doesn't seem to add up, but the imagery being used here is so profound. It's so profound. The limbs of the snake represent the fall of Satan, because the snake's limbs caused a separation between the belly and the ground, meaning there was a disconnect. Hellel, which is the translation of Lucifer, once resided in the heavens. He was up on high, yet when he fell, he was brought low. He was brought to the earth. He lost his high place. Therefore, the legs, being a symbol of that high place, had to go as well. Hallel was brought to the lowest of lows for what he had done. We spoke about this a little during the study on the flood, and we talked about the differences between Egypt and the wilderness. Both of them are a form of suffering, but what separates the wilderness from Egypt is that the wilderness is suffering for righteousness' sake, which is just another way the wilderness foreshadows Christ. If the wilderness is the suffering for righteousness, then what does that tell us about Egypt? It tells us that Egypt is suffering for suffering's sake. Egypt is meaningless suffering. Egypt is a symbol of sin, and enough time in Egypt eventually becomes hell. You spend enough time in Egypt, you're going to find yourself in hell. Suffering for the sake of suffering is the easier option, but the more costly option. This is why the devil is going to the lake of fire, because nobody in the history of history suffers for the sake of suffering, meaning vainly, than the devil, because he's the absolute contradiction to the word of God. He is the contrary to Jesus, which brings us to our next point, the flesh. God said that the snake would eat the dust all its life, and man was made from dust. Dust represents the flesh. God is cursing him to live in the flesh, to be the physical embodiment of the desires of the flesh. That's why they're evil, because they're of the devil. This tells us a little something about curses with this context. We can come to the conclusion that a curse is a pattern. It's a disconnect from God. But we also know that a blessing is the opposite of a curse. A blessing is a pattern also, but it's a closeness with God. And when God establishes a curse, what man can undo it? One question I used to see get asked a fair bit was, why won't God forgive Satan? Because if God forgave Satan, couldn't he go back to heaven and then restoration could be restored? I want to take the time to answer that quickly, because I think it applies to our point. When we looked in detail about the flood, we spoke about why God wouldn't forgive the watchers for their trespasses, because they were holy angels. They were holy, meaning they were without sin. They were pure, so God held them to a higher standard. But those fallen angels only went against God. Hallel attempted to take God down, to overthrow him, to sit on the throne of God, which resulted in him being cast down to the depths of existence. Because as we spoke about it in the first study of the creation story, the has to be a separation between man and God. The more you try to be God, the more sufferable your life would become, which is exactly what happened to Hillel. God had to cast him to hell because nothing in existence can sit on that holy throne. God's place can't be taken. It just can't be taken. And any pursuit in doing so will only lead to suffering. God did not give us sin. Sin came from the devil. Meaning when we fell into sin, we became, I don't know if I should say it. This is gonna bother you. This is gonna bother you. It's either gonna bother you or it's gonna scare you. Okay, I'll say it. God did not give us sin, which means sin came from the devil. Meaning when we fell into sin, we became made in the image of Satan. Just saying. Sin means that we're made in the image of the devil. That was the devil's attempt at hurting God, defiling his pure creation out of sheer spite. Similar to the story of Cain and Abel. Evil crushing that which is good just because it can. 1 John gives us this plainly, by the way. 1 John 3:10-12. In this the children of God are manifest, and the children of the devil. Whosoever doeth not righteousness is not of God, neither he that loveth not his brother. For this is the message that ye heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. We've spoken about the fall of Satan, how man became subject to the flesh, which means, at this point, we are all like the devil, destined for damnation, which means life is rather pointless. At this point in time, we were cursed from the get-go, but instantaneously, we are given the solution to the great and terrible problem. God hints at the coming of Christ. Going slightly off topic here, but it's important to remember that Adam was the first man, but the first heavenly body, the first spirit ever created was Jesus. For we are told that he is the first and the last. And even in John, in the beginning was the Word, it was with God, and it was God. He's as old as God himself. He is God. So, where was I? Yeah. He's the first and the last, and when you put it like that, you realize that the chances are Jesus and Hillel were probably friends. Because he was a cherub. He was a high-ranking cherub, and it said he was in charge of the worship and guardians. Now he has fallen, but what's even worse is the fact that we are now made in his image at the expense of sin. So God was merciful enough to give us a solution, a counteract act at Satan's attempt to destroy his good image, meaning his creation. And that solution is Jesus. God said there would be a disconnect between seed, as we just spoke about in 1 John. There will be a separation of seed which foreshadows the birth. You could also say that Mary is foreshadowed as well, possibly because the word does say the separation will be between thee and the woman. No, I'm looking at that the wrong way. Or am I? No, 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 I know where I'm getting at. Now, God could be referring to women in general here, but he specifically said the woman, not a woman or woman in general, but the woman. God is a